Hello, YouTube. We have a great interview today with Ezgi Başaran, a political scientist and former journalist based in Oxford. She's joining us today to help us understand what has been going on in Turkey over the past few weeks since President Erdogan's main political rival, the mayor of Istanbul, a guy called Ekrem İmamoğlu, was arrested. We're going to be finding out if there's any chance that İmamoğlu could get a fair trial or be released, whether Erdogan and his party AKP are feeling any pressure from the huge protest movement that has risen as a result of the arrest. And also, we'll be trying to work out why the international community isn't doing more to stop Erdogan from getting away with this. We hope you enjoy listening. Hello, Ezgi. Thanks so much for joining us on the Europeans podcast today. It's really nice you're here.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start by starting with the basics. What are the charges against Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, and to what extent can the decision to arrest him be traced back to President Erdogan?
Since this autumn, 2024, there had been a wave of smears began circulating. The government trolls that we all know right now, the government apparatchiks, began spinning mendacious stories about İmamoğlu being corrupt and, stealing money from the Istanbulites. And then earlier this month, there was a wide range of people linked to İmamoğlu, his colleagues, his friends, campaign staff, advertising firms found themselves banned from leaving the country, or some of them, their assets were frozen. Then came this month, in the beginning of this month, Ekrem İmamoğlu's 35-year-old university diploma, which would disqualify him from a presidential run, cancelled. Days later, he was detained alongside 106 individuals. The alleged charge is he is the ringleader of a corruption organization. And plus, there's another simultaneous investigation claiming that İmamoğlu aided the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, that is prescribed in Turkey as a terrorist organization. So there are two charges: organized corruption plus terror charges.
So, if I can pick up on that, is there any chance that İmamoğlu could get a fair trial in the Turkish judicial system?
I do not think so, because we're at the peak of judicial capture and state capture. So it's all, stacked with Erdogan loyalists. And, it's just, if you look at the chronology of how he'd been jailed, all this came right after his party, Republicans People's Party, CHP, the main opposition party, announced that there will be a membership-wide vote, like an unofficial primary, to formally endorse İmamoğlu as the sole presidential candidate. So it would be the legitimate and official candidate that would run against Erdogan. And right before that vote came the cancellation of the university diploma, and 2 days later the arrest. And if you look at we also have the interrogation file. It's a travesty of justice. It has no credible evidence, no forensic evidence, just gossip recycled by anonymous witnesses. Hearsay. There's no corruption report from any financial crime organization. And it's just that the terrifying part is the sheer arbitrariness and unseriousness of these things. Because so the police asked them about someone told us that you have did this because that person heard that the other person said this. So this is enough to detain a politician who won Istanbul actually 3 times. And the last time was like with 51% of the Istanbul electorate. So if they can do this to Ekrem İmamoğlu, one would say they, they can do it to anyone. So that is, and also that creates another layer of terror among it squeezes the space of the political practice and speech.
Yeah, and how is that looking? I mean, how is the opposition responding? Are there any other opposition politicians who are like willing to step into the spotlight right now, even though it's clearly a vulnerable thing to do?
Well, I mean, that wouldn't be a very politically right move, I believe. I mean, since his imprisonment, the opposition CHP has been mobilizing its supporters calling for protests and boycotts. And there's a growing sense that the party's leader, Özgür Özel, just emerged as a real leader, like truly come into his own as a leader. Meanwhile, Ankara's mayor, Mansur Yavaş, who had been polling as a strong presidential candidate, contender, he's taking a really principled stand. He's offering his full support to İmamoğlu and İmamoğlu's candidacy without trying to capitalize on the moment for himself. So, I mean, CHP is doing all the right things, interestingly, because that really isn't its forte, but they're standing tall, I think.
So you wrote recently that Erdogan has ratcheted up his authoritarianism to the scale of Russia and Belarus in a matter of days. Why do you think he has done this now?
Because he can. Now he sees İmamoğlu as a real threat. The economy is in shambles. So and he's extremely strong in terms of international conjuncture. Also he's done pretending. He doesn't need a facade or theater of democracy anymore. So no more concern for optics. So that's why I said I put the examples of Russia and Belarus, because when you imprison your most formidable challengers, you're no longer qualified. The regime no longer qualified as a competitive authoritarianism, which because you've now taken the legitimacy of the ballot box away as well. So he could do it because, as you can see, we've seen just a handful of Western officials saying anything. 10 years ago, it would have been just not comprehensible to think that the U.S. Secretary of State, I mean, the spokesperson of the U.S. Secretary of State would come up and say, this is an internal matter. And, we have Trump, because we have Trump there, and Trump's one of the favorite politicians of Mr. Trump is Mr. Erdogan, and he targets his opponents. He's actually mimicking Erdogan on his way to an authoritarian grip. And the Turkey will have a central role, I believe. It could be about deploying peacekeeping, troops in Ukraine in the aftermath of a peace agreement. And it is essential that Turkey joins the European security framework, or it could, deliver weapons. So it has the capacity, Turkey, and the manpower to do it. So there is this, while there's a climate of impunity where, Netanyahu continues to wage war on Gaza. It's not a war anymore. We can agree that. I mean, I don't know what many of you would agree, but I would agree that there's a genocide going on in Gaza, and he's not, Netanyahu is not a political pariah yet. So Erdogan is in a climate of impunity, and he's dealt a strong hand. So that's why he could have. So in his mind, in his thinking, he says that I can jail my opponent if they, uh, get another opponent. I can jail that, and no one can say anything. And the so far the reaction to the imprisonment of Ekrem İmamoğlu unfortunately proves him right. That's why he can do it. He did this much easier than he could have done it a year ago, for example.
I've heard it described by someone as springtime for autocrats.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and I mean, and the other reason why Erdogan seems to be doing this now is because it seems like Erdogan is less popular than he's been over the first 22 years of his rule. I mean,
Yeah.
what kind of chance did, if Imamoglu is allowed to run in a presidential election, if we were seeing the vote happen soon, I know it doesn't officially have to happen until 2028, what would be the chance that he would win that, do you think?
Well, I mean, we have to realize that yes, Turkey has have been always have free elections, but it is not fair for the last decade because, the government, Erdogan controls much of the media and also can do, limit the social media. So it's never a fair election, but and also I mean it comes. He has the advantages of being an incumbent. He has all the state resources that he can rally behind him. So it has never been fair, but as you can remember in the mayoral elections, which was March 2024. The AKP lost almost all major cities to the opposition candidates, and Ekrem İmamoğlu had a lot to do in that campaign, and he's a very popular politician. He has similarities in his human touch with Erdogan, and the recent polls show that he leads at least 4 or 5 points in front of Erdogan if there's an election held tomorrow. So that is why that Erdogan could not risk to run against someone like İmamoğlu in a free and fair elections.
So they have obviously jailed Imamoglu, but they haven't been able to jail the people yet who are on the streets of Turkey.
Yeah.
And so we've seen huge protests. And what kind of a chance do these protests have of changing anything?
Well, I mean, there you can never quite tell when or how the politics of a people, politics of a contentious situation, whose main democratic avenue, elections, has been hollowed out by authoritarian rule, will reach to a tipping point. So, social movement theory, attempts to offer tools to analyze protests and acts of nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience. But the broad consensus is that outcomes depend on a complex mix of variables and contingencies. What we do know right now is in Turkey, people are very angry, and economy is in free fall. There is very high inflation rates, and the middle class lost much of its purchasing power in the last 2 or 3 years, like drastically. Millions live in poverty. Press freedom, freedom of speech have been severely restricted, while a small circle of AKP elites and Erdogan's inner circle, including his family, continue to live with extraordinary privilege, and people see that. So this is not a good recipe for authoritarian rule, and I think the myth of authoritarian resistance have been cracked since the Arab uprising, since, what we've seen in, Serbia with, I mean, in the late 1990s with Milosevic and, other people in, color revolutions. But you'll never know. And the opposition CHP's strategy right now is to force a snap election through pressure on the parliament. That one could remove Erdogan from power. But Erdogan, in turn, will likely to seek to amend the constitution because he can't run for a third term. He needs to amend the constitution to stand for another term. But here's the critical point. Like you said, his popularity at its lowest in over 2 decades. So. And that's not just the economy. I mean, it's because the democratic space has shrunk to the point of suffocation. People are not just poor, they're also silenced, and that is a dangerous combination for any regime. But it could take years, it could take months. But I think if there is a free and fair election, anytime soon, I think it's very likely that, Erdogan may not win.
You mentioned earlier already the relationship or the lack of pressure from the European partners on Erdogan. And Turkey's relationship with the EU has been long been an uncomfortable one.
Yeah.
Is there still a viable path forward for Turkey's EU membership in light of recent events? And if not, how can the European executive exert pressure on Erdogan?
Well, I mean, like I said, I don't think because Europe is also in a dire situation when, you have Hungary within Europe that is, Hungary, Poland. We've seen a lot of authoritarian slip within the European Union. So it would look, and Erdogan would play it like that. It would look very hypocritical to dictate anything to Erdogan in terms of democratic values, where none of the European countries say anything to Netanyahu or Orban. So, and also, Turkey, we've seen the foreign minister Hakan Fidan playing an important role in talks of a security a framework of a new security framework due to in the case of a full American pullout from Europe. So, um, I'm afraid Erdogan has more leverage against the European countries than the European countries have against for Erdogan. So we just need to wait for this authoritarian tide to to um, to wane, to be honest. But I would trust the democratic forces within Turkey more than the European countries as pressure on Erdogan, to be honest.
If I can ask something, you mentioned earlier about, for example, university diploma that was now taken away from Imamoglu. So I was wondering, I know that there's also been rumors we've never really seen Erdogan's university diploma.
Yes.
And I was wondering if people ever if the press, if anyone ever kind of really points the finger at the sort of hypocrisy in this as well. Like, is he ever really being sort of shown as, or questioned, asked tough questions by the media sort of in public when it comes to this kind of stuff?
Yeah, the problem is he hasn't been talking to quote unquote real journalists for the last decade. I mean, if there's a real investigation, I'm sure that we will not see a 4-year diploma, university diploma, but a 2-year university diploma, which would make him ineligible to stand as a presidential candidate. But Alice, this is the case we're in, unfortunately.
That sounds good. Yeah, I mean, you said waiting for maybe just you said about we might wait for the sort of, as Dominic said, the springtime of dictators to wane, and maybe the era of gaslighting that we find ourselves in globally to kind of end. But do you think that is something that this generation will still experience, or are we, in your opinion, up for like a really long road of political sort of, staring in the face of this kind of power change?
But as you know, I mean, for our lifetime, it could be a long time. I mean, long, 5 years, 10 years is very, very long for our, lifetime. But in terms of if you're a historian, it's nothing. 5 years, 10 years, 2 decades, 3 decades, it's nothing. I think we will get over this. There are a lot. I mean, it's not. I mean, what we're seeing that people are angry in Greece, in Belgrade, in Istanbul, Athens, in New York, now in Tel Aviv. I think we're gonna get there, but it will take strenuous effort to sustain, to turn this anger and contention into solid political gains. But I think we will get there. I'm hopeful.